Yay! I'm so excited for you because if you're watching this video, that means that you're ready to plant your seeds and seedlings for the year, and that is so exciting. But before you do, I want you to think about a few things. Number one, I want you to make sure that you're planting in the right place. What do I mean by that? Well, if you read the seed packets, you will see that many times it's recommended to start those seeds indoors before you then transplant them out into the garden. That is because in colder climates especially, if those little seedlings are subjected to frost, they can die immediately. So if that's you, then make sure that you get yourself a seed tray like this, or if you have any of these left over from last year or years before, these work great. And plant indoors first. Here in LA and in other warm climates, we don't have to worry so much. It was about 81 degrees Fahrenheit here today, so I'd say there's a very low chance of frost coming our way. You also need to take note of special planting instructions. For example, many beans require pre-soaking before planting from between an hour to 24 hours. This one right here says soaking for 1 to 2 hours before planting speeds germination. Kind of optional on this one, some of them are not. So you need to know that ahead of time. Next, amend your soil. Every year you need to be adding good stuff to your soil to replenish its nutrients and organic matter. Every single year before I plant, I add compost, worm castings, and fertilizer. And if you want to know more about that, you can check out last week's video. Plan your garden layout. I actually draw out a map of my garden every year and decide where things are going to be planted. You need to take into account how much space you have versus how many things you want to plant, and even how productive a certain plant is. For example, cucumbers can be very productive, so you might only need 1 or 2 of those plants. You can even pay attention to information like the days to maturity, which is listed on the seed packet. It's usually listed in a range, for example, 60 to 75 days, and that is representative of the amount of time between when the seed is planted to when you harvest that crop. So if you have a very short crop, for example, radishes, they will be mature in 30 to 45 days. That's a month to a month and a half. So if you plant those radishes at the beginning of the season, you can then harvest them and replant more radishes or another short season crop and have another harvest before the growing season is over. Perhaps the most important thing to consider when planning your garden layout is crop rotation. Crop rotation is our #1 defense against pests in the garden. That's because certain types of pests prefer different types of plants, and many of them lay their eggs in the soil for easier access to food the next year. So by grouping our crops into families and then rotating where we plant those from year to year, we deprive those pests of the food that they want. So there are a few major groups of vegetables that are grown in the garden. I actually have about 4 major beds in my garden, and I group together the families that I have the most in, and then I plant them one here and I rotate them counterclockwise every single year. So last year the tomatoes were here, so this year they're going to be here. And then in this one were the brassicas. So the brassicas are now going to be here this year. And last year I had cucurbits in this bed, which is cucumbers and melons. You can see I had the trellises for growing vertically. Those are going to move over here to this bed. So you can see I have these 3 major groups. I also plant legumes and okra and corn. This right here has either okra or corn in it every year. And then I have another bed out here, don't mind the mess, that I can fit it into as needed. I actually do separate my peppers. These are peppers from the tomatoes, which have the same family, because I have found that peppers do better in smaller containers where their roots can stay drier and more warm. And you can watch my video on secrets to growing peppers for that information. These are just starting to come back for the year. I leave them outside because it's nice and warm here in LA, and therefore they don't die. But if you are in a cold climate, you would want to pick a container that's small enough that you could bring it indoors over winter, and then you can have the same method that I do. And finally, if you are transplanting seedlings that you started indoors, you need to think about hardening off those seedlings so that they can transition nicely and easily into their new home in the garden. What does hardening off mean? It means you're gradually exposing those plants to the elements that they're going to live in. On your windowsill in your kitchen or wherever you started them, they are not being exposed to the full midday sun, to the full cold of night, to wind, and all different factors that can damage them when they get out here to the garden. So what you do is you gradually expose them. You take, say this is I bought this at the nursery, but say this is my seedlings I started indoors. You would take it out of your kitchen or out of your house and put it outside for 1 hour the first day, then bring it back inside. The next day, put it back out for 2 hours, then bring it back inside, and so on and so forth. And you can continue this process for up to 2 weeks until these guys are finally ready to be planted in the garden. It doesn't always take that long, but it's recommended to do it gradually so that they don't risk being sun-scorched or, like I said, be susceptible to any of those other things. I tend to get a little bit impatient with this method, so I found a way around it that has worked really well for me, and that's using shade fabric. Shade fabric, just like it sounds, provides shade to the plants, but not fully. You can see it's a little bit transparent, and it actually lets water through as well as airflow. So I'll get into a little bit more about how to install this later. But I want to mention it now because you really need to buy this before you plant out in the garden. If you plant those little baby seedlings there and then you go run to the nursery to go pick up the shade fabric, even an hour or two in the sun when they're not used to it can scorch them and even kill them. So pick up some shade fabric beforehand if you think that's the way you're going to go. All right, let's plant some stuff. Have my tomato seedlings, which I started indoors a couple weeks ago or a few weeks ago, and then I also have some tomato seeds. Remember that I just said earlier that since there's no chance of frost here in Southern California for the rest of the year, it is okay for me to plant directly here. That only applies to you if you are in the same conditions. Okay, so first I have these seedlings. And you can probably see that I have multiple seedlings growing in each cell. That's because we planted more than one seed in the hopes that we would never put one of the cells to waste. But we do need to choose at this point which one is going to be the lucky seedling. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna thin these out and I just choose which one I think looks the strongest. It doesn't have to be the tallest. It can be the ones with the biggest leaves. There really isn't that much of a science to it. This one right here, out of these two, it has a little bit of brown right at the soil line, so I'm gonna get rid of that one. Even though it's the taller one, I'm gonna get rid of this one. So I'm just gonna gently pull it out and toss it away. Sorry, not sorry. Okay, and I have 2 left of this Get Stuffed variety. Notice I have labeled these. Very important. Let's continue to keep this label with these as we transplant them. Okay, now it's very important to know the ideal spacing of your plants, and that information is available on the seed packet. So it's pretty tempting when they're this small, or even if they're a little bit bigger, to plant more of them than is recommended, because you just can't imagine how they could possibly get that big, but they will get that big. And it's pretty detrimental to crowd your plants when you plant them in the garden. Crowded plants don't get enough airflow, so they're susceptible to things like mold. They also compete for nutrients, and therefore you won't have as healthy or as productive of plants. So resist the urge, plant only what you're recommended to plant. And for tomatoes, that's about a minimum of 3 feet between each plant. So I'm just gonna go ahead and choose one of my get stuffed tomatoes here. And you need to do this very gently. What you don't want to do is damage this seedling in any way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of gently squeeze from the bottom. I can see that the soil is lifting up as I do that. It seems to be staying together in a clump. Kind of one of the best ways to make sure that it does that is to keep that good consistent dampness in the soil, like I described on how to grow your seedlings. You don't want the soil to be too dry or too wet when you're trying to remove them, otherwise it might fall apart. So I'm going to try to do this with my left hand, even though I'm right-handed, so that... My God. That just happened. What I want to do is choose which seedling out of this bunch I want. This is the Isis Candy variety. Let's see here. There are 3 growing in this one. I'm looking at the roots. This one doesn't have a very strong root system. I'm going to go ahead and pull that out. And I'd say the same thing about this one. This guy right here seems to be the strongest. And out of this cell, I'll get rid of that guy. So now I have one of each of the Isis Candy. Okay, so you want to do this really carefully. The last thing that you want to do is damage any part of this little seedling. So what you're going to do is you're going to gently squeeze from the bottom of these cells. This is an empty one, but just to demonstrate so you can see. You're going to just squeeze gently. I'm doing this now on the center one. You might be able to see the soil is kind of bulging out. So that's nice and loose. One of the things that makes it easier to get this out is if you have that soil at a dampness that is ideal, not too wet, not too dry. That way the soil kind of sticks together as you're removing it. And then I'm just going to gently squeeze, squeeze, squeeze. Have my other hand right there ready to go. Wait until the soil kind of comes out in a chunk. See that? Another thing about tomato plants that's pretty unique is that they actually don't mind being buried a little deeper. Tomato plant has all these tiny little hairs along the stem, and tomato plants in particular have the propensity to grow roots where each one of those little hairs are. That's unique to the tomato plant. Don't plant any other plants at a different depth than what they were already growing at, but for this type of plant, you can. So I'm going to go ahead and make a nice little hole for this guy. Just get him in here. This bed is about 2 feet wide, and I am planting these plants about 3 feet apart, maybe a little less. Like I said, you don't want to crowd them too much, but I definitely want to fit a variety of different tomatoes in here, so I always push my limits a little bit. And I made a little hole, I dropped it in there. I'm now patting the soil very nicely around that plant. And now I'm going to take my label and I'm going to stick it right adjacent to that plant so that I know that is the Isis Candy. Very important, because if you end up loving this plant, then you need to remember what one it is. I'm losing light, so I'm gonna go ahead and water this up really quick and finish this video up. You must water your plants immediately after planting them. So just give this a little drizzle and remember to be really gentle with these guys. Again, they are babies. Okay, that should do it. Everything's spared. Trim all these little nails out. And voila! They're still alive. Amazing. Right, I pulled back so you can see the whole grand scheme. It looks pretty empty, doesn't it? But it will change, trust me. Making sure this is nice and tight so it's not draping on top of my seedlings. Now, I also want to show you something else really quickly. Over here, I had found some tomato volunteers. What? Tomato volunteers. These are little plants that just grew on their own in my garden bed because probably a tomato from a plant last year dropped into the bed and its seeds overwintered, and then as soon as it started to warm up, the seed was like, oh, I'm gonna grow. I have these every year in my garden, and I actually have the most delicious cherry tomatoes that tend to always volunteer. So I'm hoping that's what these are. So they were previously over here, and before I turned the bed, I just scooped them out with a little shovel and I stuck them over here next to their own little sprinklers. Tomatoes are some of the most forgiving plants when it comes to transplanting, at least when they're young. And in fact, they may actually like it. You can check out one of my first videos, Tomato Massacre, to learn more about how tomatoes respond to their roots being totally messed with. And it's good. Signing off, and remember, the more attention you pay to your garden, the better chance of success you will have. Gardening is all about looking at your plants, noticing if there's something wrong with them. Do they look different than they did yesterday or the week before? You guys can do it. It just takes a little bit of attention. Okay. Mwah. I don't know why I did that. I have dirty fingers. Well, dirt don't hurt.